For us petrol heads, concept cars are a little bit like catnip. Every time one appears at a motor show or in the motoring press, we get a little bit excited, a little bit hot under the collar. And why? Because they represent the purity of a designer's vision. They represent what's in their head, what might be down the road, the design language of a brand, what we might be enjoying in our cars in the next 5 or 10 years. What they don't represent normally is anything like you're going to get. Because by the time it's gone from the designer's board, through the accounting department, through engineering, through the product teams, what you end up with in the showroom is normally sanitized. It's molested, it's changed. It's not what the designer wanted, but occasionally, when the automotive gods align, you get literally the car that was in their head from drawing board to driveway. And one manufacturer more than any other in the 1990s, Chrysler, were the best at doing it. And they gave us two very exciting, very unusual cars, the Dodge Viper and the Plymouth Prowler. And in today's video, I'm going to show you what they're all about, how they came to be, and what they like to drive. So comb your curtain hairstyle, pull on your bag of jeans and crank up the Oasis because we're going back to the 90s. Now, I've no idea what they were smoking in the boardroom of Chrysler in the 1990s, but I don't half wish that automotive executives would start smoking it again, because it gave us some incredible cars. There are some brilliant concept cars out there today. I'll name check the Hyundai Vision 74 as a fantastic example, and that wonderful Renault Alpine 5 thing, they're brilliant. But I guarantee now, they won't look anything like that when they hit the showrooms. Whereas these are two fantastic examples of what happens when you let designers and engineers run free. And they try and kill you when you drive them, and they burn your leg, and they have silly engines. We will never see their kind again. So if you want one, now's the time to get one. So how did the Viper come to be? Well, luckily at that time, the pantheon of automotive greatness was upon Chrysler. So you've got Lee Iacocca, the man that gave us the Mustang, was at the time doing very well with other products in the range, things like the minivans and the pickups. But he decided he wanted something sexy for Dodge, something to give the cars back the image that they had with cars like the Challenger and the Charger. So he listed the help of some very clever people at Chrysler, and also brought his old friend Carroll Shelby along. And the idea was to have a car that was a modern interpretation or a 90s interpretation of the amazing AC Cobra. So if you think about it, great big engine, tiny little two-seater roadster, not much else, very basic. And if you look at the Cobra and the way that was designed and the things that brought to the party, as in not much other than a great engine and a great chassis, that really did colour and shape the design language of the Viper. And we'll come to that in a moment. But the thing that really centred about it was the decision very early on to go for a V10. A V10 that they didn't have other than in a truck, and a truck engine was never going to fit in a sports car. Two amazing facts about this car was how quickly they got it made. The concept car came out in 1989. This thing was in the showroom in 1992. That's an incredibly quick amount of time to create a brand new car. And the other thing was the amount of money that they did it for. Now, I've seen reports they did it for 70 million, which in itself is incredible, but I've read a couple of books with some inside team knowledge that said they did it for 49.9 million, which is less than you'd spend on a mid-season refresh on your standard passenger car. So to create one car from nothing in 3 years for basically, in automotive terms, no money at all, is incredible. Can you imagine going in to pitch this car into the boardroom and saying, right, I'm going to build a sports car. That makes sense, we've done those before. It's going to have a V10 engine that we don't yet make and doesn't exist. Very expensive to do. It doesn't have any door handles, it doesn't have any windows, it doesn't have any roof, it doesn't have, because this is safety conscious America, it doesn't have an airbag, it doesn't have ABS, it doesn't have traction control, it doesn't have anything safe. And this roll bar behind the back seats, that's not even a roll bar, that's just for show, it holds the back window in, so if you turn over, it will decapitate you. When you come around the back of the Viper, you can see just how wide it is. It's an interesting shape, this car, because it's not much longer, about 1.5 feet longer than an MX-5, but it's as wide as a Testarossa. Being a European spec car, it's full width number plate holder to cover up the keyhole. Now inside the boots, sort of practical. Now I've taken the roof out. When you've got all your roof paraphernalia in there, there's not a huge amount of room, but if it was a nice weekend, you could get a couple of bags, you could go touring. They even give you a spare wheel. So for such a silly car, it's the one part that's actually quite practical, and the boot does lock. So one of the reasons that the Viper ate the Cobra so well, and one of the reasons it's such a great car to drive, was the way it was constructed. So you've got a lot of resin transfer panels, which is posh fiberglass basically. And this bonnet is at the time, and even today, one of the largest single mouldings ever made on a production car. It's absolutely enormous, and it's really beautifully made and fits surprisingly well. You've got a lot of aluminium used, a lot of lightweight material, and when you think of the power and the engine size on offer, it does make the car really quite quick. Now, when you open the bonnet on a Viper, don't do this, kids, because it's very, very easy to open anyone's Viper because there is absolutely no security, because there's no door locks and no door handles. So why would you bother putting a bonnet lock on? So they just pop up from outside. Little safety catch on the inside. And then she slides forward. Wait till you see this. There you go. A V10. Not many cars with a V10, certainly not many affordable cars with a V10. Obviously, Lamborghinis have them. The Porsche has it with the 918, but at the time, this was the first production car with a V10 engine. And it's a great story because they had a V10 slated for the pickup truck, all iron, very, very heavy. And they wanted a V10 in the Viper because it's a bit more special, but you can't put a massive cast iron engine in a lightweight sports car. So they went to Lamborghini, who they owned at the time, and said, can you recast? So it's the same architecture, but it's a completely different engine. So same bore and stroke, same V angle, but much, much lighter. And really, for the time, 400 horsepower and 465 pound-feet of torque was a lot. It's not much now. There's people watching with remap Golfs going, 400 horsepower? Not very impressed. But when you think at the time, this was 100 horsepower more than the contemporary 348. It was only 12 less than the 512 TR, and it had more torque than an F40, and it's normally aspirated. And that's why everybody wanted a Viper. It's also why everybody crashed their Viper. I heard a great statistic that almost half of the first year's production was crashed within the first year. So when you sit inside the Viper, the first thing you notice, it's quite sparse. They've saved all of the budget, all of the money went on the engine and the gearbox and the drivetrain, which is spectacular, but it didn't leave much money for anything else. And also the ethos of the car was to build a modern day Cobra. If you ever sit inside a beautiful old Cobra, there's nothing there either. It's just engine, gearbox, no window winders, no windows, no roof. There is actually a bit of a ragtag stick-fed roof that goes over the top of this, and it does the job, keeps the rain out. And then you've got these hilarious side screens with zippers, but there is no security because there are no exterior handles. The only handle is this one, and this is my favourite thing. Why have they bothered making that lockable? Is that not the most pointless thing ever? Because you can just reach inside and unlock it. What a waste of money. But in here, no airbag, of course, because that would be silly. You didn't need that in 1992. Every subsequent Viper got all the safety stuff. But this is why I love the RT10, the original concept Viper, if you like. To me, is the purest because it was just what the concept car had, nothing. So you've got a very basic Chrysler radio. You don't even have aircon on this car because, again, what is the point? It's all extra weight. You can take the roof off if you're hot. You've got these little press studs on the top here. And if you're wondering what they're for, with the press studs on the back, you can put an old 1950s style, MG style tonneau over the top. So if you want to park outside at night and you can't be bothered with the stick roof, you pop the tonneau on, and then if it's raining, you get a nice little water feature in the morning. Other wonderful details, no storage of any kind, but of course they have made the only space that could have been storage into speakers, which I think is great, you know, that's what the car's for. It's about cruising and having fun. And a very nerdy fact, this actually isn't a Dodge Viper, this one. This is a Chrysler Viper, a European spec, which makes it super rare. It also means rather than seatbelts on the door, you get seatbelts in the middle, which I'm going to put on now and take you for a spin. The big thing that everybody always says when they talk about Dodge Vipers, and to be fair, probably with some reason, is that they're scary to drive and that they want to fire you off and all that kind of stuff. Now, I am driving this one respectfully today because it's lovely, it's low mileage, and it also has 10-year-old tyres on it. So we're going to go a little bit circumspectly through the country lanes of Nottinghamshire. But actually, the thing that's really surprising were two things. One is these cars are more docile than you think. They really are. In fact, the suspension is quite compliant. The gearbox and steering are really nice. The self-centering and feedback you get from the steering actually, and I mean this with the highest compliment, guys, very un-American. It's almost European, the way this car feels. The ride quality is surprisingly good, and the cornering prowess of the car, again, you know, someone that owns 2 Corvettes, really, really sophisticated. They've obviously gone for a European handling. The lateral G that this thing can generate was notable in period and is notable now. So what I'm trying to say is, actually, the Viper is a bit of a pussycat. If you drive it sensibly, on a country lane, it won't bite you. If you do silly things on and off the throttle and provoke it mid-corner, of course it's going to fire you off. But like a lot of very quick cars with big engines and limited amounts of grip, and don't forget you've got 335 tyres on the back, you've got quite a lot of rubber there, but it is surprisingly easy to drive. The gear change is absolutely delightful. The driving position for me at 6'4" with very long legs is incredibly good. It's almost like it's been made for me. You can really get your hands around the wheel. And it drives very nicely at those speeds. I think that's always the test of a great car. What's it like to drive slowly and in real life? Because that's the thing, you can't really drive more than 70 miles an hour on the UK highway. So the fun you can have on the way there is very, very important. Right, I found a bit of country lane with nothing on it. So obviously you can only drive up to the speed limit. That's always going to be the thing that reins this car in. But you can push on, you really can push on. The car, I think, is very obedient. It goes pretty much where you point it. And what I found is just not to load it up too much in the corners. Don't go flying into a corner with too much speed and then expect it to stick. It corners really well. And I think people that have come off in these cars have obviously just put too much throttle on mid-bend, because then, yeah, you will unsettle it. It's not happy. Whereas actually, pretty benign, it's pretty obedient. I wouldn't claim to be the best driver in the world. So the Viper then laid a bit of a template for Chrysler to do fun things with sports cars that were perhaps more exciting than the average man in the street might expect when they went into a showroom. So they did it again with the Prowler. So the Plymouth Prowler. Now, buoyed up by the success of the Viper and feeling quite confident with a few quid in the bank, Chrysler thought they'd try it again. And they were very clever, because what they realised in the 1990s, there was a huge amount, and I mean a huge amount, of baby boomers, about 40, 50 years old, with a few quid in the bank, who'd grown up with their dads loving hot rods. So the thinking was, if we could create a factory hot rod, people would buy it. And they weren't wrong. Now the styling, I think, it's quite divisive, but very clever. I personally love it. Very, very 90s. And what you've got is a little bit of Chip Foose, because there was a design study competition that Chip entered, and parts of his hemisphere concept you'll find in this. And then the rest is the Chrysler in-house team. I think they nailed it personally. I think as a 90s interpretation of a 30s hot rod, because if you look at the back, you can see bits of 32 Ford, you can see little bits of 34 at the front. But it just looks like its own thing. And the way they solved this into management was to say, we want to do an exploration of how to design and build an aluminium car. And this car has a lot of alloy in it. So the bonnet, the deck lid, as the Americans call it, the doors, the whole chassis tub, and huge parts, 900 pounds worth of the car, in weight terms, are aluminium. You've even got aluminium arms. There's even a magnesium substrate behind the dashboard. This was very, very clever stuff. You've got things like turnbuckle rear ends. It's trick. And there's a lot of things that people talk about the engine that they should have made a V8, but as we'll find out in a moment, I think there's a really good reason that they didn't, and I don't think the car's any worse for it. It wasn't just very clever thinking in terms of body construction, which was brilliant for its time. If you look at things like the suspension, so of course, on an old hot rod, you'd have an I-beam front. This being the 1990s, they've gone fully independent, alloy arms, and if you look, no damper. If you think of where it is on a Caterham 7, it sits here. On the Prowler, it sits inboard, like a race car, and it's very trick because it's fully adjustable. Now we can't be under here looking at the suspension without addressing the elephant in the room, and that is the engine, because when this car was launched, everybody, including some of the management at Chrysler, wanted it to be a V8, but really that led to a lot of problems. So it was launched with a 3.5 litre V6. Now the first ones for the first 2 years were iron, and they were heavy, because like a lot of this car, to make this car look so beautiful and have all this stuff, they had to use a lot of parts bin from other Chrysler products. So the early cars, just over 200 horsepower, 0 to 60 in 7.1 seconds, which isn't slow, but isn't the hot rod that people wanted. Now, come the 99 model year, they fitted this one, which is a lot quicker. It's aluminium lump, so it's much lighter, still 3.5 litres, but 253 horsepower. And in period, Motor Week got this down from 0 to 60 to 5.7 seconds. Now that, if you think about it, current GR Yaris, 0 to 62 in 5.5 seconds. This is not a fast car, but it's not a slow car either. And even though Chrysler said they wish they'd fitted a V8, actually I think it's perfectly in keeping for the time. And being a V6 and being alloy and being so far back in the chassis, again, mid-mounted front engine car, makes the handling really good. Now, one of the key ingredients of a hot rod, even in the 1990s, was a bit of a stance, a bit of a rake. And they achieved that on the Prowler by the use of 17-inch wheels at the front. And what was really clever, and a world first, if you look, 20-inch on the back. Now, I know the kids watching this are going, 20-inch, mate, my mum's Range Rover's got 20-inch wheels. But in the 90s, this was the world's first car to have it. So there you go, pub quiz fact, you'll know that one for next time. Also has a boot, believe it or not. Well, I say boot, have a look at this. You won't get much in here. And that is literally all the space you've got. You can get a very small, very flat suitcase in there, and that's about it. So if you're going for a weekend away, go with someone that packs light or has very small clothing. So as you gracefully enter your Plymouth Prowler, which is actually quite hard to do because the doors open a comically small amount. So if I get any fatter, I won't fit in. But in here, it's a parts bin special, let's be honest. To make this beautiful car, they had to nick parts from every other Chrysler car. So you'll recognise things like the heater vents, the stereo, the gear shifter. So everyone knows this is the steering wheel off a Jeep, but if you look in the middle, they've done a bespoke horn push and airbag, and this little motif of a prowling Prowler or a Jaguar with a hangover. It's also on the seats. Dodge Viper door handles. But they did what they could, and that kept the cost down. That made the whole thing completely tenable. But what you do get, because they've been made in the parts bin, is a lot more creature comforts than you ever got in the Dodge Viper. So suddenly we've gained electric windows. We have a roof. We have air conditioning. We have all sorts of things. And you also get this really beautiful retro sort of hot rod inspired dashboard where you've got everything in the middle in front of you, your speedo. And this, for me, is the icing on the cake. This fabulous little autometer tack that sits on the top, which is exactly what a hot rodder would have done. They wouldn't have integrated it. And doesn't that look stuck on? And that's the entire point. Every car has that, and it looks like something that an aftermarket person has botched on top. And to me, it's perfect. But it drives really well because this is the later engine with the more power and the quicker acceleration. So I think, buckle up, I'm going to take you for a spin. So we're out on the road in the Plymouth Prowler. The first thing you notice, if the road surface isn't perfect, the car doesn't like it. It does bump a little bit. Because of those inboard dampers and those massive 20s on the back, it is a bit surface sensitive. I think that's fair to say. And also it's a very different character to the Viper. The Viper is all about shouty power. This is much more of a cruiser when you get off the very bumpy back roads near my garage. It was more about how it looked than how it went. But that's not to say it doesn't go really well, because if you can find a nice empty bit of country road and a 60 limit and put your foot down, it does this. And there is 60. Like I said, it's a lot faster than you think. It's also really civilised. What I love about this car, again, really hard to get into, particularly if you're tall, but a great driving position for tall lads, loads of leg room, really great in terms of your arm reach on the wheel, so you can get round for all that opposite locking you're going to be doing. And I don't even mind the fact you could only get this car as an auto. You can flip it through the stick shift if you want to, but why would you? It's just a cruiser. But it's great. That shows the diametric opposition of these two models. You couldn't get an auto on the Viper, you couldn't get a manual on the Prowler. Tells you everything you need to know. So which is the best to drive in the country? Well, it really depends on the kind of day you want to have and the kind of place you're going. You could argue on a country lane like this, on a lovely summer's day, driving to the pub with your better half, I'd probably take the Prowler. If it was a great sweeping country lane with loads of corners, I'd probably take the Viper. The ideal thing is, of course, to have one of each. But the most amazing thing about this, bearing in mind it is a hot rod and you have got all of that crazy experimental chassis work, so the chassis was all new, the suspension was all new, everything basically, although it's parts been robbed on the inside, everything underneath apart from the engine is stuff that they've had to develop for this car. And for a car that was developed again in very short time, it's incredibly accomplished. It really is. It rides and drives like a car that has been on sale for a very long time and has a lot of development in it. And this is almost a Skunks Works project that's made it onto the showroom floor. And I just think it's incredible. I think it's a bit of a feat of engineering. And it's quite quick off the mark. Something you notice when you drive the Prowler, bearing in mind you could pick one of these up, a rough one, and this is a slightly rough one, you might have noticed. You could pick a rough one up for 20, 25 grand. A nice one's 30, 35 these days. But for 20-something thousand pounds, I paid 21 for this one, you can drive around in the car, and I am not kidding you, stops traffic. The amount of people that will come up to you, and I don't care if you have a Lamborghini, a Ferrari, a Huayra, whatever it is, this stops more traffic for £21,000 than any of those cars, because it's cool, it's cartoonish, and nobody knows what it is. I love the fact whoever designed this car just committed to the whole concept, the whole team behind it. Obviously loved hot rodding, so many design cues. And I think the fact to take the design cues from your competitor, there's so much 34 and 32 Ford in this. So for Chrysler to tip its hat to its arch rival at Ford, I think that's quite big, I really do. I think that shows a huge amount of respect for the art of hot rodding and the cars that went before them. It might not be for you, and I respect that, but for the time, for the 90s, because please Google the fashions of the time. Look at the hairstyles people had, look at the clothing. It was a terrible time for fashion. So actually, I think this is quite tasteful and restrained. So they do say never meet your heroes. They say never buy the car that you've always wanted to buy. And in the case of today's videos, I've bought both the cars I wanted to buy when I fell in love with them in the 90s. Neither have disappointed, and I would say both have exceeded my expectations. So if you can take anything from these test drives and walkarounds today, is if there's a car that you've always wanted to own, you know what, give it a go. Try and find it, it'll probably be on Car and Classic, and it could be better than you thought.